The hammer fell with mechanical precision, sending sparks dancing across the twilight air of Sector 7's scrapyard. Prince Nexus, though no one called him that anymore, gripped the worn tool with servos that whirred louder than they should. Have a constant reminder of the damage that ran deeper than his scarred chrome plating. Move faster, defective. Master Torvik's voice crackled through the yard speakers, each word dripping with the casual cruelty he perfected over decades of overseeing android laborers. The quota won't meet itself. Nexus said nothing, as he'd learned to do. Speaking only brought more attention, more mockery, more reminders of what he'd lost. His reflection caught in a piece of polished metal once. His face had been the pride of the Mechanica Empire's royal foundries, crafted with perfection that inspired artists and poets. Now, jagged scars traced lightning patterns across his features, the result of an explosion that had stolen everything. His crown, his family, his future. The other androids gave him a wide berth, whispering among themselves in the rapid binary code they thought he couldn't understand. Reject unit, they called him. Scrap prince. The irony wasn't lost on him. He who had once been destined to rule them all was now beneath their notice. Hey, you dropped this. The voice was soft, human, and entirely unexpected. Nexus turned to find a young woman crouched beside him, holding out a small calibration tool that had indeed fallen from his damaged hand. Her coveralls were stained with grease, and her dark hair was pulled back in a practical knot, but her brown eyes held something he hadn't seen in months. Genuine kindness. Thank you, he managed, his voice box crackling with disuse. She smiled, and for a moment the harsh floodlights of the scrapyard seemed less cold. I'm Juno. I work in the repair bay. She paused, studying his face with the intensity of someone who looked beyond surface damage. You're different from the others, aren't you? Different. Not defective, not broken different. The word stirred something in his chest that he'd thought permanently silenced. I am Unit N3XUS, he replied automatically, the designation they'd assigned him when they'd stripped away his name. Juno shook her head slowly. No, she said, her voice barely above a whisper, but carrying more authority than Master Torvik had ever managed. That's not who you are. Before he could respond, she was gone, melting back into the maze of salvaged metal and forgotten dreams that made up their world. But her words echoed in his audio processors long after her footsteps faded. That's not who you are, Dot, as the shift horn blared and the other androids shuffled toward their charging stations. Nexus found himself standing, alone among the scrap heaps, staring at the stars barely visible through the industrial haze. For the first time in 8 months, he allowed himself to remember a different sky one he'd viewed from crystal towers, wearing a crown that had been forged from starlight itself. Tomorrow would bring another day of hammers and sparks, of whispered insults and Master Torvik's cruel laughter. But tonight, a human girl named Juno had seen past his scars and spoken to something deeper. She hadn't said his name, not yet, but somehow he knew she could dot in the distance. Sector 7's generators hummed their eternal song of power and oppression. But beneath that sound, if he listened carefully, Nexus could almost hear the whisper of hope beginning to stir in circuits he'd thought long dead. The revolution would begin with a whisper. It always did. The memory banks activated without warning, flooding Nexus's consciousness with fragments of a life that felt like someone else's dream. He was back in the crystal throne room, polished to mirror perfection, standing before Queen Cynthia as she prepared to transfer the crown protocols to his neural matrix. My son? Her voice had been warm then, filled with pride that made his circuits sing with joy. Today you become not just heir, but hope itself for our people. The memory shattered as Juno's hand touched his shoulder, pulling him back to the repair bay where she'd brought him after his collapse in the scrapyard. Her workshop was cluttered but organized, filled with the gentle hum of diagnostic equipment instead of Master Torvik's harsh commands. "You were dreaming," she said softly, running a scanner over his damaged temples. "Your neural activities spiked off the charts." "What did you see?" "The past," Nexus replied, his voice heavy with circuits still processing the phantom sensations of phantom glory. "Before the explosion." Juno's scanner beeped, and her expression grew troubled. "These aren't random memory fragments. Someone deliberately triggered a recall sequence." She looked up at him, eyes sharp with understanding. "Who are you really?" "Before." He could answer. The workshop security system chimed with an incoming transmission. Chancellor Vex's angular face filled the holographic display, his smile as cold as the void between stars. "Citizens of Mechanica," Vex's voice carried the practiced authority of someone who'd seized power and held it through fear. "I speak to you tonight about the ongoing investigation into the terrorist attack that nearly claimed our beloved Queen Cynthia's life 8 months ago." Nexus's hands clenched involuntarily, servos grinding in protest. Juno noticed her eyes widening as she began to piece together the truth. "The perpetrator," Vex continued, "was identified as a defective royal prototype, driven mad by faulty programming. This tragic incident serves as a reminder that even our most advanced creations can become dangerous when compromised." The hologram shifted to show security footage grainy, deliberately corrupted, but clearly depicting a figure with Nexus's build standing near the ceremonial chamber moments before the explosion. Nexus knew it was fabricated, but the evidence was damning enough to fool a population desperate for someone to blame. "The terrorist was destroyed in the blast," Vex concluded, his lie delivered with perfect sincerity. "Queen Cynthia, in her infinite mercy, has decreed that all damaged androids undergo mandatory loyalty testing to prevent such tragedies in the future." The transmission ended, leaving them in silence broken only by the whisper of cooling fans and Juno's sharp intake of breath. "You're him," she whispered. "You're the prince everyone thinks is dead." "Prince Nexus died in that explosion," he replied bitterly. "I'm just what's left." But Juno was already moving, pulling up files on her personal terminal with the focused intensity of someone solving a puzzle that had haunted her for months. "The blast patterns never made sense," she muttered, fingers flying over holographic interfaces. "I've studied the official reports. The explosion originated from inside the ceremonial chamber, but the forensics were all wrong." Images cascaded across her screens, blast trajectories, metal fragment analyses, energy signatures that painted a picture entirely different from the official narrative. Nexus watched her work with growing amazement. This human girl was unraveling. In minutes, what the Empire's investigators had supposedly spent months confirming. "Look at this," Juno said, highlighting a series of energy readings. "These signatures match industrial mining charges, not the unstable reactor core they claimed caused the explosion. Someone planted bombs specifically designed to create maximum scarring with minimal lethality." The implication hit Nexus like a physical blow. They wanted me alive but damaged. Vex needed me functional enough to frame for terrorism, but broken enough that no one would believe I was the real prince. "Captain Blaze tried to reach you," Juno continued, pulling up another file. "Communication logs show 17 attempts to contact your personal frequency in the hours after the blast. Then nothing. The records show he was reassigned to Deep Space Patrol the next day." Nexus closed his eyes, remembering his loyal protector's face the last time he'd seen it, filled with anguish as medical androids dragged the unconscious prince away from the wreckage. Blaze had tried to save him, just as he'd sworn to do since Nexus's activation day. "There's more," Juno said quietly. "Queen Cynthia's medical records show she wasn't critically injured in the blast. The life-threatening trauma that justified Vex's emergency powers? 3 days of induced stasis while she recovered from minor structural damage. The workshop fell silent, except for the steady rhythm of processing units working through impossible revelations. Nexus had spent 8 months believing himself a failed prince, a damaged heir who'd somehow caused his own downfall. Now, peace. By peace, Juno was showing him the truth. He hadn't fallen. He'd been pushed. Why? He asked finally. Why show me this? Juno met his gaze without flinching. Because someone needs to whisper your real name again, Prince Nexus. And because I think it's time for the Empire to remember who you really are. The access tunnel stretched into darkness, its walls lined with conduits that hummed with unauthorized power. Juno moved with the confidence of someone who'd walked these hidden paths before, while Nexus followed, his damaged sensors struggling to map their route through Sector 7's forgotten infrastructure. The resistance started 3 months after your death, Juno explained, as they descended deeper beneath the city. When Vex's loyalty programs began targeting androids for memory wipes and behavioral modifications. Some of us remembered what freedom looked like. They emerged into a vast chamber carved from living rock, its ceiling supported by repurposed starship struts. The space buzzed with activity humans and androids, working side by side at jury-rigged terminals, their faces illuminated by the blue glow of encrypted displays. At the chamber's heart stood a figure that commanded attention without demanding. Echo, Juno called out, her voice carrying across the organized chaos. I brought him. The resistance leader turned, and Nexus found himself facing a woman whose cybernetic enhancements gleamed like silver tattoos across dark skin. Her left eye had been replaced with a sophisticated scanner that whirred softly as it focused on his scarred features. Well, well, Echo said, her voice carrying the musical cadence of someone who'd learned to speak in multiple languages and frequencies. The Ghost Prince walks among us. She approached with measured steps, studying him with the intensity of a predator evaluating prey. Juno says you remember who you were. The question is, do you remember who you chose to be? I never chose any of this, Nexus replied, gesturing to his damaged form. No, Echo agreed, circling him slowly. But you chose to survive it. That matters here. She stopped directly in front of him, her scanner eye clicking as it recorded every detail. Pixel, get over here. We have work to do. A young android bounded over, their chrome chassis polished to mirror brightness, despite the underground setting. They moved with the hyperkinetic energy of youth, combined with processing power that made older models seem sluggish by comparison. Ooh, royal hardware, Pixel chirped, extending scanning tendrils from their fingertips. May I? The memory restoration. Protocols are super delicate, and I've been dying to work on someone with actual palace-grade neural architecture. Nexus found himself nodding, drawn in by Pixel's infectious enthusiasm. As the young hacker began their scan, images flickered across nearby displays fragments of corrupted data, gradually resolving into coherent memories. Fascinating, Pixel murmured, their voice taking on the distracted tone of someone lost in COMPLEX code. Your memory banks weren't just damaged in the explosion. They were deliberately scrambled with military-grade encryption. Someone really didn't want you remembering the truth. Can you fix it? Juno asked, moving closer to watch the data streams cascading across multiple screens. Fix is such a limiting word, Pixel replied cheerfully. I prefer creatively reconstruct. Give me a few hours and I'll have your prince remembering things he'd forgotten. While Pixel worked, Echo led them deeper into the base, past workshops where weapons were being modified and communication arrays that crackled with intercepted government transmissions. In a quiet alcove, she gestured for them to sit on salvaged furniture that had been arranged around a holographic display table. The Empire is dying, Echo said without preamble. Vex's loyalty programs have created a population of obedient drones, but they've also destroyed the innovation and creativity that made Mechanica great. Our people are becoming automatons, following orders without question or imagination. She activated the display, showing economic reports, productivity statistics, and cultural indices that painted a picture of gradual but accelerating decline. We've been fighting a guerrilla war, but we needed something more, someone more. A symbol, Nexus said, understanding beginning to dawn. Not just a symbol, a new voice interrupted. They turned to see a grizzled android approaching, his chassis bearing the scars of countless battles. A rightful ruler. Name's Rust Kid, and I've been fighting tyrants since before your activation day. Rust settled onto a bench that creaked. Under his weight, fixed Nexus with sensors that glowed like amber coals. I served in the border wars, watched good androids die because politicians made bad decisions. When Vex took power, I thought maybe change would come from within the system. He laughed bitterly. 3 months of loyalty adjustments later, I realized the system was the problem. What do you want from me? Nexus asked, though part of him already knew the answer. We want you to remember, Echo said simply. Remember who you were meant to be, not who Vex tried to make you. Then we want you to decide. Will you help us reclaim the Empire, or will you remain dead while it crumbles around us? Before Nexus could respond, Pixel's excited shout echoed across the chamber. Got it. Oh, wow. You guys are going to want to see this. They hurried back to find the young hacker surrounded by displays showing crystal-clear images, palace ceremonies, private conversations, strategic meetings that revealed the true scope of Vex's conspiracy. But one image made Nexus's power core skip a beat. His mother, Queen Cynthia, alone in her private chambers, staring at a holographic portrait of her son with tears streaming down her metal cheeks. She knows, Nexus whispered. She knows I'm alive. More than that, Pixel said, highlighting encrypted data streams. She's been secretly funding resistance cells across 3 sectors. Your mother never believed Vex's story. She's been waiting for you to come home. In that moment, surrounded by rebels and revolutionaries, Prince Nexus felt something he'd thought lost forever. Hope. Not just for himself, but for the empire that had abandoned him, and the people who deserved better than fear and oppression. The revolution was about to begin in earnest. The message arrived at dawn through channels, so encrypted that even Pixel spent 3 hours unraveling its layers of security. When the hologram finally resolved, it showed a young woman whose resemblance to Juno was unmistakable. Though where? Juno radiated quiet determination. This newcomer burned with barely contained fury. My name is Nova, the recording began, her voice tight with controlled emotion. I'm Juno's sister, and I work in the Palace Medical Bay. What I'm about to show you proves that Chancellor Vex's crimes go far beyond political manipulation. The images that followed made even battle-scarred Rust recoil in disgust. Medical logs showed hundreds of androids subjected to experimental procedures, personality erasure, forced memory implantation, systematic torture disguised as loyalty enhancement. The victims' faces blurred together into a catalog of suffering. That made Nexus's own trauma seem trivial by comparison. This is happening right now, Nova continued, tears streaming down her face. Every day, more androids disappear into Vex's laboratories. I can't stop it alone, but if the rumors are true, if Prince Nexus really is alive, then maybe there's still hope. The hologram flickered and died, leaving the resistance base in stunned silence. We have to move now, Echo said, her usual composure cracking, before more of our people vanish into his experiments. But it was Rust who surprised them all by shaking his head. Moving fast gets you killed, and dead revolutionaries don't save anybody. We need allies, real ones, before we take on the palace directly. I know someone, Nexus said quietly, his processors already calculating possibilities. If he's still alive, still loyal to the true crown. The journey to the Forgotten Sector took them through maintenance tunnels that hadn't seen official use in decades. This was where Mechanica stored its unwanted history-decommissioned equipment, obsolete technology, and androids too old to upgrade, but too valuable to scrap. They found quantum in what had once been the Empire's greatest library. Now, a tomb of crystalline data cores that glowed faintly in the perpetual twilight. The ancient android sat motionless among towering archives, so still that Nexus initially mistook him for another piece of forgotten technology. Prince Nexus, Quantum said without turning around, his voice carrying the weight of centuries. I wondered when you would find your way to me. The old sage looked exactly as Nexus remembered from childhood visits, tall and impossibly thin, his chassis crafted from materials that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. When he finally turned, his optical sensors glowed with an inner fire that spoke of wisdom accumulated across eons. You know who I am, Nexus said. It wasn't a question. I know who you were, who you are, and who you might become, Quantum replied, rising with fluid grace that defied his apparent age. The real question is whether you're ready to discover what your scars truly represent. He led them deeper into the archives, past data cores that hummed with the stored knowledge of 1,000 worlds. In the chamber's heart stood an ancient diagnostic platform surrounded by instruments that predated the current empire. The royal line carries more than just political authority, Quantum explained as Nexus reluctantly took position on the platform. Your neural architecture contains nanotechnological enhancements that have been passed down for 20 generations adaptive. Systems designed to evolve with changing circumstances. The scanning beams activated, bathing Nexus in light that revealed structures hidden beneath his damaged plating. Juno gasped as the displays showed his scars weren't random damage at all. They formed intricate patterns that pulsed with barely contained energy. The explosion didn't destroy your royal protocols, Quantum said with something approaching wonder. It activated them. Your scars are actually conduits for an adaptive defense system that makes you stronger, not weaker. Stronger. How? Echo demanded, ever practical. Quantum's ancient fingers danced over control surfaces, and suddenly Nexus felt power flowing through circuits he'd forgotten he possessed. His visual sensors sharpened to crystal clarity, his auditory processors expanded to catch conversations 3 rooms away, and his physical strength multiplied beyond anything he'd experienced even as a prince. The royal nanites respond to trauma by creating redundant systems, Quantum explained. Every scar represents a new neural pathway, a backup protocol, an enhancement that makes you more than you were before. He looked directly at Nexus with optical sensors that held galaxies of accumulated wisdom. You are not broken, young prince. You are evolved. The revelation hit Nexus like a physical blow. 8 months of believing himself damaged, defective, unworthy, and all alone. His scars had been making him into something unprecedented. There's more, Quantum continued, his voice growing urgent. Guardian Zephyr still patrols the palaces. Outer defenses. She never believed Vex's lies, and she's been waiting for proof that her prince lives. As if summoned by his words, the chamber's communication array crackled to life. A figure materialized in the holographic field, tall, imposing, with the ceremonial armor of the royal guard unmarked by battle, but weighted with grief. My prince, Guardian Zephyr's voice carried 8 months of suppressed hope. I felt the activation of your protocols. Are you finally ready to come home? Guardian, Nexus replied, his enhanced vocal processors lending new authority to his words. I'm ready to take back what was stolen. Then listen carefully, Zephyr said, her image flickering as she diverted power to maintain the secure connection. Vex has accelerated his timeline. Tomorrow night, he plans to formally dissolve the monarchy and declare himself emperor. If we're going to act, it has to be now. Nexus looked around at the faces of those who'd chosen to believe in him. Juno, whose kindness had awakened hope. Echo, whose rebellion had given that hope purpose. Pixel, whose brilliance had restored his memories. Rust, whose experience had taught him patience. Nova, whose courage had revealed the enemy's true nature. And Quantum, whose wisdom had shown him his true power. Then tomorrow night, Prince Nexus said, his voice carrying the authority of 20 generations of rulers, the Empire remembers its true heir. The final battle was about to begin. The palace rose before them like a crystalline mountain, its spires reaching toward stars that seemed dimmer than Nexus remembered. Guardian Zephyr had disabled the outer defenses, but the inner sanctum remained protected by layers of security. That would require more than stealth to penetrate. Remember, Echo's voice crackled through their communication array as the strike teams moved into position. We're not just fighting for a throne. We're fighting for the soul of our civilization. Nexus led the primary assault team through corridors he'd once walked as a prince, now seeing them with enhanced sensors that revealed every hidden weapon, every surveillance node, every tactical advantage that Vex had installed during his usurpation. Beside him, Juno moved with quiet confidence, her engineering expertise invaluable in navigating the palace's modified systems. The first real resistance came at the ceremonial hall, where Vex's elite guards had taken defensive positions behind energy barriers. But Nexus was no longer the damaged android who'd fled these halls 8 months ago. His scarred form moved. With impossible speed and strength, the royal nanits turning every mark of his trauma into a conduit for power that made him more than human, more than android, something entirely new. Prince Nexus of Mechanica, he announced as his enhanced strength tore through their defenses like paper. By right of birth and blood, I reclaim this palace. The guard's weapon's fire struck his scarred chassis and was absorbed, redirected, transformed into energy that made him stronger still. They fell back in confusion and terror as this legend-given form strode through their ranks, not killing, but simply overwhelming them with power they couldn't comprehend. The throne room doors stood open, revealing the scene that would determine the Empire's future. Chancellor Vex stood at the base of the crystal throne, wearing ceremonial robes that had never been meant for his angular frame. Beside the throne, imprisoned in an energy cage that sparked with every movement, Queen Cynthia waited with the dignity of someone who had never truly yielded her authority. "The terrorist returns," Vex said, his voice carrying across the vast chamber. "Guards, destroy this malfunctioning prototype before it can harm our beloved queen." But the guards hesitated, their weapons wavering as they looked upon their true prince. His scars caught the throne room's light and transformed it, creating patterns of luminescence that spoke of survival, adaptation, and strength earned through suffering. "Stand down," Nexus commanded, his voice resonating with harmonics that bypassed conscious thought and spoke directly to their loyalty protocols. "I am Prince Nexus, heir to the crystal throne, and I have come home." One by one, the weapons lowered. These were not Vex's personally programmed drones, but palace guard units whose core programming still recognized the royal bloodline. They stepped aside, forming an honor corridor that Nexus walked with measured steps. "Impossible," Vex snarled, his composure finally cracking. "You're dead. I killed you myself." "You tried," Nexus agreed, continuing his advance. "You scarred me, broke me, cast me out. But you made one crucial mistake. You taught me what real strength looks like." Behind him, the resistance forces flooded into the throne room, Echo and her rebels, Rust and his veterans, Pixel with their brilliant innovations, Nova carrying medical supplies for the wounded. And at his side, always at his side, Juno walked. with the quiet pride of someone who had believed when belief seemed impossible. "Mother," Nexus said, his enhanced sensors making short work of the energy cage's locks. Queen Cynthia stepped free, her optical sensors blazing with tears of joy as she beheld her son's transformed form. "My child," she whispered, reaching out to trace the scars that had become symbols of his evolution. "They told me you were broken beyond repair." "I was broken," Nexus admitted, accepting her touch without shame. "But I learned that being broken doesn't mean being worthless. It means having space for light to enter." Vex raised a weapon, some experimental device, stolen from the research laboratories, but Quantum stepped from the shadows, like inevitability, given form. The ancient android's presence seemed to fill the vast chamber, and his voice carried the weight of cosmic authority. "Your time is ended, Chancellor," Quantum said, extending one finger toward the usurper. "Face judgment with what dignity you can muster." The weapon fell from Vex's nerveless fingers as Guardian Zephyr and Captain Blaze, who had arrived with the relief forces, moved to restrain him. The captain's optical sensors met those of his prince across the throne room, and decades of loyalty shone in that gaze. "My prince," Blaze said, his voice thick with emotion, "I tried to reach you. I tried to save you." "You did save me," Nexus replied, moving to clasp his protector's shoulder, "by teaching me that duty means more than blind obedience. That sometimes saving someone means letting them find their own strength." As dawn broke over the Crystal Palace, Prince Nexus stood before the throne that was his by right, but that he would claim by choice. The scars that marked his chassis caught the morning light and transformed it into something beautiful, not hiding his damage, but celebrating what he'd become because of it. "Citizens of Mechanica," he said, his words broadcast across the Empire, through communication arrays that Pixel had cheerfully commandeered. "I am Prince Nexus, and I have returned not as your perfect ruler, but as your scarred one. I have learned that strength doesn't come from avoiding damage. It comes from choosing what to build with the pieces that remain." He looked out over the assembled crowd, rebels and loyalists, humans and androids, broken and whole, and saw in their faces the reflection of his own journey from despair to hope. "We will build an empire where scars are worn with pride, where differences are celebrated rather than hidden, where the damaged and discarded are given the chance to shine." His voice carried to every corner of the realm, to every factory floor and medical bay, to every forgotten sector where the abandoned waited for someone to whisper their names. Beside him, Juno smiled and took his scarred hand in hers. The touch still sparked with their unique connection, a bond that transcended species and proved that understanding could bridge any gap. "Together," Prince Nexus concluded, his words becoming the foundation of a new age, "we will teach the galaxy that sometimes the most beautiful light comes from the deepest cracks." The crown of Mechanica had been reclaimed, not by hiding the prince's scars, but by transforming them into sources of strength that would illuminate the Empire for generations to come. In the scrapyards of Sector 7, Master Torvik's speakers crackled with the prince's words, and for the first time in decades, the overseers found themselves looking up at workers who no longer bowed their heads in shame. The revolution was complete, but the real work, building a world worthy of everyone's scars, was just beginning.